This is GARIS, Masculist, MGTOW flyers. That is 2-3 page essays on the themes of masculism and MGTOW. Written by and read aloud by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. This is flyer number 167, entitled Using MGTOW's Strongest Political Argument. Description. This flyer argues that MGTOWs, who have up till now been rather politically passive, should use the, quote, population annihilation argument, end quote, to force society and the gender politicians to menfair, that's the verb, the gender laws. This argument is the nuclear weapon of the MGTOWs/masculists and should be used to huge effect. Now the flyer itself. Using MGTOW's strongest political argument. The MGTOW's strongest political argument is, quote, if you gender politicians don't menfair society and the gender laws, then we MGTOWs/masculists will wipe out whole populations by continuing to reject paternity, end quote. This is an incredibly powerful argument that the gender politicians and society as a whole cannot afford to ignore. It should be obvious to any thinking person that it's only a question of time before the population starts crashing in the Western countries, the way it has already started doing in Japan. So that society, the media and the gender politicians need to address the problem before it becomes catastrophically serious. In Japan, for example, in a mere 2 decades after the baby boomers have died, the Japanese population will have fallen by 1/3 of its current figure to about 80 million. The Japanese birth rate is 1.4 children per woman, compared to the replacement rate of 2.1. So if the current rate continues, Japan will be wiped out. But 2/3 of young Japanese men under 35 now refuse to marry, refuse to have kids, and spend their money on themselves. As this herbivorism spreads through the generations of men, there will be no more Japan within a century. A similar story holds for many Western countries, e.g. Spain, Italy, Germany, all have birth rates of 1.4. In Singapore, it's even lower. 1.0 for the Chinese and Indian subgroups. That's in Singapore. So time is on the side of MGTOW/masculism. Sooner or later, the gender politicians will be forced to listen to us and to make the gender laws menfair by reforming divorce law, bringing in the paternity rejection right, eliminating sexual discrimination against men across the board, etc. Politically minded MGTOWs who care about the plight of other men can really use this most powerful of MGTOW political arguments to harangue the gender politicians and other groups. They can accuse the fluffy feminists of indirectly wiping out the population by having made the divorce courts toxic, and hence marriage toxic for men, by having taken them over and lobbying the gender politicians to bias the divorce laws heavily in favour of fluffies. MGTOWs need to become a lot more political by bringing their message of young men, don't marry, don't have kids, spend your money on yourself, don't be a fool. If you marry, you'll have roughly a 1 in 4 chance of being financially massacred in the fluffy feminist dominated divorce courts. You'll lose your kids with a 90% probability. You'll lose your house to your fluffy ex-wife so she can raise her kids in it. You'll be forced to pay child support to kids you'll barely see, and alimony to a fluffy parasitic ex-wife who has no legal obligation to get off her fat parasitic ass and become a fit, financially independent person. Sooner or later, the broadcast media is going to latch on to the population crash and its primary cause, that is, that young men are refusing to marry and have kids due to the fluffy feminist domination of the divorce courts and the pandering to them by the extremely short-sighted and selfish gender politicians whose political horizons extend only to the next election. Once the broadcast media do get interested in the issue, and with countries like Germany, Italy, Spain and Japan all at a birth rate of only 1.4, this has to happen. Then the MGTOW spokesman can present the MGTOW/masculist case. They can threaten the gender politicians with the strongest of MGTOW arguments given above. They can accuse the fluffy feminists of being hypocrites, wanting their cake and to eat it too, wanting equal rights with men, but not being prepared to accept equal obligations with men, namely becoming FIPs by studying FIP majors at high school and college. These fluffy feminist hypocrites want to keep having manslaves work and pay for them. Parents and teachers need to be taught that young women have a powerful moral obligation to become FIPs and pull their own financial weight. Otherwise, they'll be punished by MGTOW/masculists, by being ignored by men, left to rot on the shelf to extinction, manless, loveless, sexless, babyless, poor, and shunned increasingly by a society that becomes ever more sympathetic to men's lib ideas. I get bored by Sandman's constant analysis of the ills of the gender status quo for men. He's good at educating peaker men, that is, people who have IQs, whose IQs lie in the peak of the bell curve, that is, of average intelligence, of the psychology of women. But I never hear any talk from him on political plans to get society motivated to liberate men. He is passive and apolitical, believing, falsely in my view, that there's nothing men can do to actively change society to make it menfair. He is politically blind. The above argument is obviously more than powerful enough to force society to menfair itself. Those MGTOWs who are more politically inclined, I suggest you start politicking by helping to set up men's lib groups in every high school, every college, sending flyers to the media, writing articles in the print media, and making videos on YouTube in the form of men's studies, that is, whole courses on men's lib and its many ideas, writing books on men's lib, setting up men's studies at universities, etc. Part of MGTOW's problem is the false belief, e.g. Sandman and others, that there's nothing that they can do but to go and strike against marriage and paternity, due to the fact that more women than men are voters, and that the gender politicians cater to women more than men. But with an angry male half of the population, gender politicians cannot afford to alienate men, otherwise they will lose the male vote, and hence the elections. Not all women will vote for a biased feminist agenda. MGTOW/masculists also need to change the intellectual climate so that women feel an enormous moral pressure on them to be FIPs or be ignored by men. MGTOW/masculists need to spread the word that a woman who is not a FIP, that is a fluffy, with fluffy attitudes towards men, will be punished. She will rot on the shelf. Quote, "Be FIP or be manless." End quote. Quote, "No calculus, no baby." End quote. Quote, "Fluffies rot on the shelf." End quote. Quote, "Fip up or die out." End quote. MGTOWs need to know that they have a very powerful argument, the population annihilation argument, that they can use on society. It is their nuclear weapon. It cannot be ignored. It cannot be refuted. It has immense power. The MGTOWs should really use it together with the masculists. Cheers. Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. YouTube channel name De Garis, Masculist, MGTOW, Flyers. Ciao.